Hi everybody. I'm going to read another chapter of Mrs. Peter Rabbit by Thornton W. Burgess. And first of all, hello to Jackson, Matthew, Marjorie, and Emma, all in Maine. Millie and Lucas in Missouri. Hello to Kai Ming and Ru Kai in Washington State. Hi to Hope here in Maine. Dylan and Lucas in Maine. Friends Leslie and Mary way over in England. To Ezzy and Indy in Oklahoma, to Kayla here in Maine, and to Sylvia, Macy, and Lillian in Maine, Harper and Judson in Maine, Caden and Xander in Maine, and hi to Evangeline and Isaac in Rhode Island, to Mabel in the country of China, to Oliver, Madeline, and Wyatt way out west, and Alex in Passanumkeag, up the Penobscot River. Okay, hi everybody. Now chapter let's see, 27. Mr. Mocker plays a joke on Mrs. Peter. This little point remember, please, there's little gained by those who tease. That's by Peter Rabbit. Mr. Mocker the Mockingbird had been very late in coming up to the Green Meadows from way down south. The truth is, he had almost decided not to come. You see, he loves the sunny Southland so much, and all who live there love him so much, that if it hadn't been for Uncle Billy Possum and old Mr. Buzzard, he never would have thought of leaving, even for a little while. Uncle Billy and old Mr. Buzzard are particular friends of his, very particular friends, and he felt that he just had to come up for a little visit. Now Mr. Mocker reached the Green Meadows just after Peter Rabbit had brought little Mrs. Peter down from the old pasture to live with him in the dear old briar patch. He knew that little Mrs. Peter didn't know anything about him, for he never had visited the old pasture where she had spent her life. But he knew all the bird people who do live there, for he had met them in the sunny Southland where they spent the winter. I believe I'll go pay my respects to Mrs. Peter, said Mr. Mocker one day, winking at old Mr. Buzzard. Old Mr. Buzzard chuckled and winked back. I certainly hope you all will behave yourself right proper and not forget that you is a member of one of the oldest families in the South, said he. Mr. Mocker looked quite solemn as he promised to behave himself, but there was a twinkle in his eyes as he flew toward the old briar patch. There he hid in a thick tangle of vines. Now it happened that Peter Rabbit had gone over to the sweet clover patch, and little Mrs. Peter was quite alone. Somehow she got to thinking of her old home, and for the first time she began to feel just a wee bit homesick. It was just then that she heard a familiar voice. Little Mrs. Peter pricked up her ears and smiled happily. That's the voice of Tommy Tit the Chickadee, and it must be that his wife is with him, for I hear him calling, Phoebe, Phoebe. How lovely of them to come down to see me so soon. Just then she heard another voice, a deep, beautiful, ringing voice, a voice that she loved. It was the voice of Veery the Thrush. Oh, cried little Mrs. Peter, and then held her breath, so as not to miss one note of the beautiful song. Hardly had the song ended, when she heard the familiar voice of Red-Eye the Vireo. Little Mrs. Peter clapped her hands happily. It must be a surprise party by my old friends and neighbors of the old pasture, she cried. How good of them to come way down here. How glad I shall be to see them. With that, little Mrs. Peter hurried over to the tangle of vines from which all the voices seemed to come, and eagerly peered this way and that way for a sight of her friends. But all she saw was a stranger wearing a very sober-colored suit. He was very polite, told her that he was an old friend of Peter Rabbit. If you are a friend of Peter, then you are a friend of mine, said little Mrs. Peter very prettily. Have you seen anybody in this tangle of vines since you arrived? I'm sure some friends of mine are here, but I haven't been able to find them. No, said the stranger, who was, of course, Mr. Mocker the Mockingbird. I haven't seen anyone here, and I don't think there has been anyone here but myself. Oh, yes, indeed there has, cried little Mrs. Peter. I heard their voices. I couldn't possibly be mistaken in those, especially the beautiful voice of Veery the Thrush. I would like very much to find them. Mr. Mocker had the grace to look ashamed of himself when he saw how disappointed little Mrs. Peter was. Very softly, he began to sing the song of Veery the Thrush. Little Mrs. Peter looked up quickly. "There it is!" she cried. "There!" She stopped with her mouth gaping wide open. She suddenly realized that it was Mr. Mocker who was singing. I'm very sorry," he stammered. "I did it just for a joke, and not to make you feel bad. Will you forgive me?" "Yes," replied little Mrs. Peter, "if you will come here often at shadow time and sing to me." And Mr. Mocker promised that he would. Well, Mr. Mocker the Mockingbird's a pretty good bird, isn't he? That's the end of that chapter, folks. We'll read another one tomorrow. Okay, bye-bye, everybody.